It was July 20, 1969, 45 years ago today. Australian journalist Derryn Hinch was at Cape Kennedy to watch the Apollo 11 astronauts blast off into space on their historic journey to walk on the moon. As part of commemorations here in Australia, yesterday Derryn was invited to address the Australian Space Association. Here's what he had to say.
It still gives me goosebumps as well, actually. It is strange being here because to talk about space and things like that on a day when, in recent days, all our thoughts have been on MH17. And our eyes have been skyward for the worst possible reasons because of the horror happening in Ukraine. And I was thinking as I drove in today, back to a time about 18 months after Apollo 11, or 2 years later, and I was at another space shot down in Houston, and just outside Mission Control, I walked into the bar at the Holiday Inn Hotel late one night, as journos do, on NASA Boulevard 1, and there at the bar was Buzz Aldrin, and he's having a drink, as Buzz often tended to do, and he heard me order a beer and he heard my accent and he said, "Oh, you're from Australia," and we started to chat. And why I tied into today is that as we sat there at the bar very late at night, he talked about the year that he and Neil Armstrong and Michael Collins had just done, touring the world as heroes and as the adventurers that they were. And he looked at me and he said, "You know," he said, "for a minute there," he said, "we really brought the world together, didn't we? We really brought the world together." And you say yes at the time, but thinking back 45 years later, and the answer is no, we didn't. We were there together briefly, but you've still got today people being shot out of the sky and what's happening in Gaza.
Back then, Derryn was a 25-year-old newspaper reporter, making his first live radio broadcast. Listen to the excitement in his voice as he describes the liftoff.
And it's 1 minute and 1 second. We're going into the final countdown on man's flight to the moon, and it's just absolutely incredible here. The rocket is just raring to go. It's 50 seconds now until man takes off on this flight, and frankly, I just can hardly describe to you the excitement and the tension and the feeling of goosebumps that, well, this time we're really going, and it starts a whole new phase of man's life. Down to 31 seconds, 30 seconds. We've got so little time now before we finally take off. It'll lift off very slowly at first. Ignition will come at 8 seconds probably, and there are these big sort of brake things which will hold it down until we get to 0, and then it will take off very slowly, so slowly you think it's going to fall over. Now I'll give you the final countdown.
Righto, Derryn, take it.
10, 9, 8, 7, 6, we have the ignition sequence, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, 0, and the flames, you can see them now, and she's ready to go. It's starting to move, and if you can hear the noise, you can probably hardly hear me, but there she goes, and it's pulling away from the crowd. They're yelling, "Go, go, go, you beaut!" And now you'll hear the rumble. The stand where I'm sitting is shaking, the lights in the stand are shaking, and there it goes. It's incredible. This huge white flame, there's smoke all around this thing. I'll just let you listen for a second to the noise. The people are on their feet and they're saying, "Go, you beauty! Go!" And here it comes now, this roar. And we can still see it. It's gone into a very small patch of cloud. It's going to become clear again now. Where there we go. It's flaring on. It's an absolute beauty. You can still hear that sound. I know that as long as I live, I am never going to see anything quite like this one. The Americans have really done it, I have to tell you that. The smoke's clearing a bit from around the old gantry where she went from, but everything's fine. She's peeling off now, and it's really on the move. So that's about it, Brian. I guess I'll hand you over to Voice of America now. They'll have the details of when that first stage separates and when the next stage and where she's going. We're finally losing a little bit of the sound, so I'll say goodbye to you, Brian, and to your people in Sydney from Cape Kennedy.
45 years on, these are his memories of that special day.
45 years ago, I was lucky enough to be there, to be at Cape Kennedy, to watch them leave, to describe the blast off for Australian radio, for the Macquarie Network, and to watch it all happen, watch it all unfold. And it was one of the most, well, I think I said in the broadcast, as long as I live, I'm never going to see anything quite like this. And 45 years later, that holds true. That really holds true. It was an awesome moment when we saw Aldrin and Armstrong and Collins blast off from Cape Kennedy at 9:32 a.m. In the hot Florida sun. It was boiling hot. It was so hot. I was on the phone talking to Australia, and I could hardly hold the phone. But to back up a bit, we had to go out there the night before because we were worried about traffic jams. We had to get them hours and hours and hours before, because there were 1 million people who had camped out around the lakes and rivers of that part of Cape Canaveral, that part of Florida, to watch it. And so people were arriving there days before for this big event. And we got there just before midnight, and then the stand set up there like a football stadium stand for the journos, and we were. It sounds like a long way away, but we were only 3 miles across the water from the Saturn V rocket. Now, even from that distance, it seemed huge. And you have to keep in mind, the Saturn V was about 35 stories high. Now, that is as tall as the Australia Square building in Sydney, and about as big. And so it's sitting there, and when it took off, it just lumbered off like this huge skyscraper taking off and heading off on a 250,000-mile journey to the moon and back. Before it, I was lucky enough to be in a press pool early in the morning, around about 2 a.m. I suppose, because Armstrong and Aldrin and Collins, they went out in a big van out to the launch hours before to settle in, and I was in this press pool, and we managed to be standing within about 10 feet of them as they came out and walked towards the van, waving at people with all their big Michelin-type spacesuits on and carrying their life support systems. And they were all thumbs up and smiling behind their big fishbowl bubbles. But there were people in the crowd there, staff, who were crying. And that fear, and it was fear because these are pretty brave guys. You have to remember, it was only a couple of years earlier that Apollo 1 blew up on the pad, and Gus Grissom and Chaffee and White were incinerated. They were killed in the Apollo 1 capsule atop their Saturn V rocket. And of course then they had unmanned Apollos right through until Apollo 8, I think it was, and then 9, then 10. And 10, of course, circled the moon and came back. They didn't land. And Apollo 11 was going to be the moon lander with the Eagle, and it did. But out there, in that heat, and watching it take off was just awesome. What I remember most of all these years later, and I still get goosebumps when I hear the broadcast, all these years later, I can remember, apart from that heat, was that as it took off and this wall of sound, it really was a Phil Spector sort of wall of sound, just hit you. It was like being hit in the stomach with a baseball bat. It really felt that strong, bang, as it hit you. And as I said in the broadcast, the lights in the stand were shaking, the stand itself was shaking, and you actually could feel the sound. It sounds crazy, but you could actually feel the sound. And I remember that night when I got home to my motel, and we'd been up probably for 48 hours straight working at that stage. I got home and I was having a shower. I looked down at my legs, and these 2 big black stripes across my thighs. And there were black bruise marks from where, obviously, my knees had been slamming up and down on the table, in this rough sort of table in the press stand. It was an extraordinary experience, because you're watching men. When you think now, you say, I saw men go to the moon. And all of you watching now, if you're old enough, you'll say, I remember when men went to the moon. And most people in Australia who are a certain age, they can remember that they were in school, because it was around lunchtime, and I think it was about 12:30 in Australia, most in the East Coast, and so all the school kids were all crowded around. People were crowded around in offices. Back then, of course, 1969, we only had black and white TV, so you weren't watching it in colour. And everybody seems to know. It's like we can say, I knew where I was when John Kennedy died, when I heard the news, and you knew where you were when men walked on the moon. It was a most extraordinary story to cover. And then the Australian connection pretty accurately told, well, I'm told it's not accurate now, the Dish movie, I saw that as part of this weekend's celebrations, but the Dish movie took a bit of poetic license as to what really happened at Parkes. And anyway, what really happened at Parkes really happened at Honeysuckle, but that's a different story. But Australia was heavily involved. We were, the pictures going around the world of Neil Armstrong's first step on the moon came through Australian stations. And the other bit of trivia about Neil Armstrong walking on the moon was that he goofed his lines. The plaque he left on the moon, he and Aldrin left on the moon, had the real saying, but when he stepped out of the lunar lander, that last step down onto the lunar surface with his ruled moon boot, he actually said, that's one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind. When you analyse it, it was probably the most famous piece of tautology ever, because what he meant to say was one small step for a man, one giant leap for mankind. At first they tried to tell us, the first spin doctors, that the word A had been lost in transmission. It wasn't, he just didn't say it. But the actual quote is there, I'm told, that quote, "We came in peace for all mankind." Neil Armstrong, of course, died on the operating table in 2012. Buzz Aldrin, Edwin Buzz Aldrin, is still alive, still going strong, and Michael Collins. The other bit of gossip about the Apollo 11 was that Buzz Aldrin was meant to be the first man to walk on the moon. He was meant to be first. They trained for Aldrin to go first. He was the lunar lander pilot, and he was meant to get out first. But Richard Nixon, the president, decided fairly late on that it would be better for American international relations if a civilian walked on the moon first, and that was Neil Armstrong, who was a civilian. And so Aldrin nearly pulled out, nearly spat the dummy. But his father was also in the military, and the word is that his father said to Buzz Aldrin, "You are a military man. Your commander-in-chief, meaning the president, says you will go second, you will go second." And as history shows, he did. But Neil Armstrong became the first man on the moon, Buzz Aldrin became the second one. 45 years later, you listen to the blast off, watch the blast off, watch them bouncing around the moon. It was an extraordinary thing. I would have bet money that by now we would have had colonies on the moon. I didn't believe that at the end of Apollo that we'd go all this time and men would not go back. Now they're talking about perhaps men landing on Mars in 2025. I would have thought, as I said, we would have colonised the moon by now. Didn't happen. And I noticed on Facebook some of more ignorant of my subscribers still think it didn't happen. Maybe they think that Capricorn 1, the landing on Mars, was real, and Apollo 11 really wasn't. But I can assure you, it happened. There it was. But on to this weekend, it's fascinating to think back to the day when the man on the moon, was really two men on the moon. It was one of the greatest stories I've ever covered.